All right, welcome everybody. Welcome everybody. Come forward. We got plenty of seats. Fill in, fill in, fill in. It's a pleasure to have you here for a DAG special event. We're very fortunate to have Angela with us tonight. So, as we get into it, when we're in person at DAG, we used to go around the room and everyone would introduce themselves. We don't really have time for that. So, what we're doing these days is I'm going to put about 90 seconds on my clock here and ask you to talk to whoever's next to you, get to know them, say hi, figure out why you're all here and why you're all here together. I'll be back. All right, let's bring it back together. We like to do that, get everyone a chance to get to know each other, swap some cards, some email addresses. Hopefully, you'll all follow up, get to know each other a little more after that. Okay, let me get into it. So, welcome again. This is a special event for DAG. We typically kick off talking about some of the advocacy items we're working on around town. If anyone has anything they're working on, events, exhibitions, important meetings, stuff you need to get off your chest about the built environment, raise your hand, I'll call on you, can say a few words. We're also very happy to be co-hosting with APA Pennsylvania tonight. Thank you to all the folks from APA Pennsylvania who are here. So a few advocacy items. DAG gave testimony, as did many others, on the state of the city's, or lack thereof, inner city bus terminal. It continues to be a real big problem for this city as they consider keeping it on Spring Garden Street longer and longer. That's not an acceptable solution as far as we're concerned, as far as many people are concerned. And we're continuing to advocate for other sites. Inga Saffron's here. Thank you for all your work on the bus stations and proposing alternate sites. So keep up the pressure, keep talking about that, keep sharing thoughts and making sure that we have what is just a critical piece of infrastructure that every major city should have. We've also been working a lot over on Gray's Ferry. Again, Inga, sorry, twice, had a great article that came out this morning about what's going on along up in Gray's Ferry along that corridor, sort of in light of the CHOP garage proposal and a lot of the pushback, some of it from DAG, plenty of other folks had a lot of things to say about that location and that site and the whole concept of offloading your parking responsibility onto another neighborhood. So that project is going to come back for a second CDR hearing before too long. So we'll be there and we'll be commenting again, but read the article, stay up to date on that one, and hopefully we can put some pressure on. And you know, George has shared it with the Planning Commission, so they're aware of the study that DAG worked on in 2020 and 2021, looking at that area. And it was a conceptual community planning study. So that's on our website right now as it was relevant to this discussion. So check it out under the advocacy tab. Other items. So we've been talking a lot about the 250th and what's going on for next year and how we can make Philadelphia as exciting and wonderful and clean and safe as it can be. And there are a ton of ideas. We've spent a lot of time talking about them in here. We've had multiple presentations from Michael Numis and other folks about what's going on in 2026. DAG has had a bunch of our own work on recommending ideas. We crowdsourced a bunch of ideas from all of you. We need money, don't we all? So right now is the time with the city trying to finalize their budget to really put the pressure on. Councilman Squilla, Council President Johnson really leaning in on those folks and trying to make sure that there is the funding in that budget to do all of the great and exciting things that we want to do and prepare for it, in a way that we can get things off the ground for next year. So since all of you talk to those folks all the time, tell them that and share that with them and make sure that they're working hard to get that funding into the budget. And on funding, of course, as we've been saying a lot, we need to fund SEPTA. That's the other one. That's the obvious one that we're all focused on. We're going to do more events with APA. This is the most applause we've had on one of these. So fund SEPTA, push to fund SEPTA, do what we can to, whatever levers you have available to you, and let's try to get that done. The only other note I had on my list, and since Paul, you're sitting right here, do you want to talk about your event next week?
Might be better. Paul Steinke, Preservation Alliance for Greater Philadelphia. Our 32nd annual Preservation Achievement Awards event will be held next Wednesday night. That's where I will be this time next week. Hopefully many of you will be there as well. Sponsored in part by AIA Philadelphia, so we appreciate that. And we will be honoring, among others, this year, our James Biddle Award for Lifetime Achievement is going to someone who's very important to DAG and who is sitting in this room, and his name is David Brownlee. Can I ask him to please stand? Wherever he is, where'd he go? There he is. There he is. And I guarantee you, if you come next week, his acceptance remarks will be worth the price of admission. So please join us.
Thank you, Paul. So before we jump in, I just want to let you know about our next two events. We're sticking with the Wednesday theme. So we'll be back here in a few weeks on June 18th, talking about 17 Market West. That's the 1701 Market Street building that Alterra Property Group is about finished with renovating into 299 apartments. It's a fascinating project. It's a really interesting office to residential conversion. We've got the whole team, developer, architect, MEP engineer, interior designer, and contractor. So they're going to talk about that project specifically and how that relates to the topic of office to residential conversions. So come check that out on the 18th. And then July 9th, we will be back with Joe Cernick, the president and CEO of the Schuylkill River Development Corporation. They opened their wonderful, beautiful new bridge recently. And he's going to come talk about the process that led to that, the construction of that, and all their dreams for the future and all the connections they want to make. So that's July 9th. That's also a Wednesday. Tickets are free, but it helps us know how much wine to buy if you sign up. So please go on our website and sign up. With that, we're going to have a Q&A at the end, but let me invite our speakers up here and we'll get started. So I'm going to introduce Leah Eppinger, and she's going to take it away. Leah is the executive director of the Dauphin County Housing Authority. She's the president of the Affordable Housing Associates of Dauphin County, and she's the president of APA Pennsylvania. So Leah, have at it.
This on? Yep. Thank you so much. So glad you are all here today. I really appreciate the opportunity to come and chat about housing because I do it all the time in Central PA. It's just a little bit of a different atmosphere. I get much less smiling faces when I talk about it in Central PA. But I am not going to introduce Angela with her very, very long bio, which tells everyone how awesome she is, which is why she is here in Philadelphia. And instead, I'm going to tell you all about the story about when I met her. It was in the grand city of Minneapolis. I had just become a chapter president in APA. And at the conference, they have this really big shindig at the end because we're all celebrating that we are done doing our responsible things. So what you may or may not know is Angela loves to dance. And I met her very awkwardly on the dance floor. She was dancing. I was absolutely not dancing. And we had this very cute moment where we realized who each other were. And that's how we became friends. So that is partly why I'm here, is because we're dance buddies, but also because we are both very much ingrained in the affordable housing world, both in Pennsylvania and also throughout the country. So with that, we're so glad to have you here in Philadelphia. I will read your official title because I would, feel bad if I didn't. She is the Chief Housing and Urban Development Officer, and we're so excited that Philadelphia now has one, right? Because we've been in cities all over the country with housing officers, and Philly did not. So we're going to do a little bit of an icebreaker before we talk about the hard stuff. So can you talk a little bit about what brought you to this role to Philadelphia and why you were inspired to work in housing in the first place?
That isn't an icebreaker, nor is that light, but okay. No, first, thank you for having me. I know a few of you in the room, so thank you to those I've met, and I look forward to meeting the rest of you this evening. And, I think what attracted me about this job, one of the titles I currently hold is I am the past national president of the American Planning Association, and I was here, is that 23? 23 was our national conference was here, and I fell in love with this city. And, I moved here from Chicago, and Philly and Chicago remind me each other in some really great ways, in that city of neighborhoods, kind of have that grit, super passionate about your sports teams. And at least in your case, your team's winning. Chicago doesn't have that, and they're just as passionate. But what attracted me about this job really is when you think about the housing landscape, you always hear the story about Philadelphia being, the poorest large city, and that's not what you see. But more importantly, it's still, it still has some pockets of affordability, but it's really important that that's protected so that the city of neighborhoods can continue to be housing for the existing residents. And that's what attracted me about this job. And the timing is just really great because you have both a mayor and a council that's hyper focused on that. And so to be able to come here and be a part of that is what had me really uprooting my life in about 3 weeks, I would say, and get here because of timing. And I don't suggest that to anybody. Definitely take more than 3 weeks to move 2,000 miles.
So as you mentioned, you worked in Chicago, but you're a native of Seattle.
And don't blame me for the rain today.
Yes. Can you talk about what some of your first impressions of Philly were? Why did you fall in love with it other than the obvious reasons?
I think even though I'm from the West Coast, I always used to say growing up, I was going to live on the East Coast. And I don't know, I felt like I was supposed to be on the East Coast, but my parents made bad decisions when they got married. But, I think what it really was is I just really like people who are passionate about where they live and people that have a lot of energy around that. Like since I've been here, everybody, if they know who I am or not, if I say I'm new, they give me their best neighborhood, their best restaurant. I have a list of places I need to go. Some I don't even know where they are, but I really enjoyed that. And I think one of the things that I thought the proximity of New York, I expected that kind of brutish kind of atmosphere, and I haven't experienced that. And so that was part of it. But I really, really just like the neighborhood aspect of Philadelphia. And it does remind me a lot about Chicago. And then it's just a really great city.
Yeah. So right before we dive into policy, quick question. Are you a cheesesteak with or without? Or are you a roast pork kind of gal?
I don't even know what that means. So there's that.
We have a lot to learn. Perfect.
It's kind of like when you get to Chicago, people ask you thick or thin crust. I'm like, I don't like pizza like that. So I never get an in card on food. So
no, that's all right. We'll fix that. So as the outsider being brought in as an expert on housing to implement this mayor's plan, how has your introduction been to the Philadelphia political environment? And how do you see yourself navigating it successfully to implement such an influential plan?
You know, I kind of have spent my whole career as an outsider in that I started my career in grad school in New Orleans. I'm definitely not from there, and I worked for the mayor of New Orleans. And if you guys think you guys are kind of incestuous about your hometown, New Orleans is really bad. Because the first question they ask you is, what school did you go to? And I think they mean college, and they're talking about high school, because you guys kind of do that too, but not in the same way. Because they're trying to figure out your class, they're trying to figure out all these things. And so I've navigated it before. And, you know, Philadelphia and Chicago are very, very closely aligned politically. Same kind of council. Ours is, well, this is, I actually upgraded because Chicago has 50 council members. You guys only have 17. So I actually got a win there. But, you know, there's implications of policy that are very, very similar. And the benefit is a lot of things don't matter where you are or where you're from. They're kind of the same and, you know, addressing some of the same issues. I think the difference that I'm finding here is particularly on the topic of housing. I was amazed at the press conference when the mayor was introducing me and signing the executive order, the room was filled. I'm not going to say how many years in my career, have not experienced that many people who would be in the room for a press conference to talk about housing. And so it showed a lot about how much the community cares and how passionate people are about housing here in Philadelphia. And that's really exciting. Even the people who may or may not agree with my take on housing, it's just exciting to know that people really care about providing housing opportunities for all.
And on that topic, there's a lot of discussion about building housing and what does that mean for the neighborhoods where we're putting new housing? Are we pushing people out? Are we bringing new people in? What's your strategy to provide this sort of fully accessible housing product that is going to engage the neighborhoods to maintain their neighborhood structure?
Have any of you heard the mayor talk lately? If you've heard the mayor talk about this, you know that is one of her biggest concerns, is ensuring that people are, we don't want displacement to be a part of any type of housing strategy. And so the whole purpose of the home plan is it's a comprehensive strategy to really encompass the whole housing continuum. And so when you think about what are the strategies, you know, we're still kind of figuring some of that out, but we're looking at ensuring that we are providing housing opportunities for all. And, you know, I think when I think about what that means, some of the programs we're keeping. There are programs that people here really love. Those are going nowhere, but we're also looking at implementing some other ones. One of the things I like the most about the plan, and the mayor's hyper-focused is on home ownership opportunities for this region. Philadelphia, for a large city, has some of the highest home ownership percentages in the region, really in the country. And so we want to ensure that that still remains the same, but we also want to expand the opportunity for people to purchase homes and first-time home buyers, but also protecting those people who are aging in place, and it becomes a little bit harder for them to keep their homes. I live this daily with my aging father, but you know, we want to make sure that we are providing housing for everybody who chooses to live here. And that's a big part of the plan, and making sure that with that, we are supporting existing neighborhood residents and including them in the process. So one thing I've learned is our mayor likes to be out in community, and you know, I've seen more communities from town hall meetings since I got here than I have because I've visited them because I was touring. And so in making sure we're incorporating that feedback has been really, really important.
And making that opportunity across the board. I've heard you talk about equity in housing, and your role in Chicago leaned a little bit more to the supportive housing area,
Yes.
which is different than just housing for all. Can you talk a little bit about how that equity in housing can, you know, spread out across the city, and how do we make sure that it's not just a plan, but we're actually acting on that?
You know, I think equity has become such a dirty word lately that it's just somewhat frustrating for me. And, you know, I think so prior to my coming here, I was the director of the Illinois Office of the Corporation for Supportive Housing. And CSH is both a CDFI, so they do lending, but we also do programmatic work. And let me be clear, I'm a recovering developer. I don't do finance anymore. So I was on the program side, but really looking at how do we ensure that we're looking at systemic barriers to housing, because people can argue a whole lot they want about a whole lot of things, but you cannot argue that there have been systemic barriers that have kept people of color and low-income people from housing. That's a fact. It can be debated on how you measure it, but that's factual. And so it's been important to really think about how do we invest in programs that really lower those barriers to first-time home buyers, renters. I think a lot about, you know, we live in a city that has a residential requirement. we have a residency requirement. So we've got to think about municipal workers. And if the city of Philadelphia is not affordable to particularly the lower end workers for the city, but we make them live here, I'm from Seattle. Nobody who works for the city of Seattle who didn't get in 20, 30 years ago can afford a house. So if they had a residency requirement, it would be very hard to create workforce housing, because I don't live in Seattle because I can't afford to live there, nor can my dad, which is why he might be coming to live with me. So, I think that's kind of the perspective that we have to think of when we think about that, and just really think about it's why we do it. But aside from why we do it, think about, I think this is somewhat controversial to some people. I do think housing is a human right. And so when I think about it from that perspective, I think when I think about this sounds a little depressing, but if I were to think about what I'd want what I did between the dash, I would want to say that I did everything I could to ensure that everybody has a safe, affordable, decent place to live, to not only live, but also to thrive. And so thinking about the backbone for how we build community, often it really is housing, because, it's kind of like, if I have nowhere to live, please don't talk to me about going to school. You think about homelessness in the school district and how that's impacting the ability for kids to learn and to read. And, thinking about a lot of the work I did before was dealing with frequently users at hospitals and really looking at a flexible housing pool, because we don't want people in emergency rooms because they need somewhere to sleep when it's cold. And, that's a really horrible way to house people. And, but then you have to think about the flip side. You have to think about people like my dad, who are on a fixed income, that live in one of the most expensive cities in the world. But my dad went to college. He has a degree, has a pretty good retirement income, but he can't compete with market forces in Seattle. So you've got to think about those people who want to age in place, or you have to think about the kid who just finished high school and is going to work for a trade. And, thinking about what housing looks like for all of that, which is why sometimes some of our programs are so limited and they're so tight fixed that they don't allow for economic mobility. And so that's one of the things we're looking at doing with the home plan, is ensuring that we're creating programs that give people a margin of space to grow economically. The city has a lot of programs to really help people improve their circumstances through education, through workforce development, all of these things. We've got a ton of housing counselors, but you make a nickel over a housing program and you no longer qualify those, and that's creating additional problems and stress on the system that's already stressed. So that's one of the big things that we think about when we're thinking about the home plan and how we expand our programs to really meet the whole housing continuum. And if you're on the Housing Advisory Board, don't ask me no questions later.
So you already mentioned a little bit about sort of the mix of rental and ownership opportunities in Philadelphia.
Yes.
Is this plan going to provide some structure or data on sort of what the target mix is going to look like for this new 30,000 units we're aiming for?
We do. And if you come to our housing town hall tomorrow, which I forget where it is, it's at 6 p.m. somewhere, you can learn all about that, because I don't know it off the top of my head. But we actually do have a chart that kind of links that out specifically on preservation is the largest portion of the home plan, mostly because, there's great existing housing stock here. And the only problem with that housing stock is it may not be quite livable. So preserving the existing housing stock, one of the things that most people, including myself, love is the architecture in this city. And so we want to make sure we're preserving that. So the lion's share of the 30,000 units is that, but recognizing we are also going to have to build new. The city has a lot of vacant land, and utilizing our vacant land to provide housing opportunities is also another part of the ban. And working on the systemic barriers that make that available. Developers in the room, we recognize that. You don't got to tell me. We know we got to make that process better. So keep that to yourself. Got it, noting it now. But, just really looking at that, but recognizing that getting to 30,000 units in the mayor's first term is going to be a very ambitious but achievable goal. But mostly what's going to make it achievable is working with all of the folks like you all who are really interested in the built environment, but more importantly, providing housing. And I know I've got a lot of supporters on the preservation side.
Yes, absolutely. So a lot of building new housing and building development in general is building trust with communities and building relationships. How do we build trust, and how does the mayor's office in this plan try to build trust with communities that have traditionally felt overlooked by the city and by their community, so that we can make sure that they have housing opportunities in their neighborhoods as well?
I can honestly say this on behalf of the mayor and this administration, but also I think although I sit in the mayor's office, I sit with the planning department, whose partner is PHDC. And I think I can equally speak for all of them that they're all exceptionally committed to community engagement, outreach, and public input. I think there's a lot of registered community organizations here. There's also a lot of neighborhood advisory committees and being committed to, enhancing that process. But I think another thing that's a reflective of that commitment is we have housing town halls that we've been committed to, but we also have had a budget town hall in every city council district. And it's a lot. It's a lot when you just started. But I can't complain because what I can promise you is Mayor Parker comes at the beginning and she stays to the end. So she's not asking of us anything that she's not doing, but it also shows her commitment to engaging community. And she doesn't sit in the front. She sits out in the audience because she's a people watcher and she wants to hear your responses. She wants to see how you respond to what she's saying and she wants that feedback. And since I've been here, I think PHDC has had at least 4 outreach events and I've only been here 2.5 months. So, I would say those departments are really committed, but also in providing resources to community organizations. If you want somebody to come talk about a program or whatever, we're here. And so that's always an open avenue. And events like this are part of that. And, I'm always super excited. I think part of the reason originally when I took this job, I was going to sit in the planning department, but I think the reason they shifted me to the mayor's office is to provide that kind of face time administration you can see, touch, and feel. So I'll be on a road show, so feel free, email me, invite me. I'm looking at Jamila to see if I have permission to say that, but invite us. It may not be me, but we are really committed to making sure that we make people be available to have that type of conversation, good and bad. I'm not scared. I've been living on the south side of Chicago. I can have any conversation.
So since you talked about planning and sitting in the planning office, obviously zoning has a big impact on housing development and how it occurs and where it occurs. We've seen a lot of blanket action with zoning overlays in the city that create density caps over districts instead of corridors. How will you and your team sort of look to addressing the zoning side of this conversation so that we can be more successful reducing barriers to development? I don't think I'm ever getting invited back here again.
I'm looking for the elephant that's going to walk through this room. Listen, I have spent the last 2 years being APA president talking about zoning reform. I sat on the Chicago zoning board through the March meeting. I had started this job and flew back to the zoning board. So I have a strong personal opinion on that. But I'll stick to my city answer. Catch me later. I can give you my personal one. But, the planning and development department, one of the things the mayor's executive order in February did was ask all city departments to think about the barriers and obstacles from their departments that would impede housing. One of the departments that did that was planning. And so any of you who are nerd out on city council, there are a series of zoning bills that are going to council and there's 4 now, but there will be more coming later, but they're basically going to be looking at, and I'm going to read my notes to be real accurate, to increase the speed of approval, clarify the city code in some ways that you're mentioning, reduce the cost of development, and to create more housing units. And so the first set of bills is going through now, and those aren't necessarily huge bills. These are kind of the easy, low-hanging fruit ones. But over the next year or so, you'll see both the planning department and city council kind of working through that, because it's important to note that the planning department doesn't write that, council does. So you'll see them working with council. And those of you who have strong opinions on it, now is a great time to be letting your city council member know where you see that, particularly those of you who are developers. I'm a recovering developer, so I certainly get a lot of that, but it really means a lot to council members to hear from their constituents about the things that could help the city work better. And that's part of the mayor's goal is with the home plan is to make the city work better for our residents. And that's certainly one of them. So please don't ask me anything about L&I and any of that. They were talking about Otis, and for my first 2 months, I thought they were talking about an elevator. So, I just learned what Otis was like last week. So,
So if you don't love zoning, you want to talk about something else, let's talk about funding, because that always invites me back.
Yeah.
So obviously that's a critical conversation in getting affordable housing or any housing in any development through. Obviously years ago, we had the controversial soda tax that brought some funding into the city to help balance some budgets. But Mayor Parker has proposed borrowing 800 million without really acknowledging or pointing out a real funding stream on how they're going to take on the debt. Can you talk a little bit about what you guys have internally talked about, if you're allowed, and how sort of the federal environment may be coming into a play in this current moment?
I'm going to unapologetically read you verbatim what I got, because that is not my bailiwick. I just told you I don't like the numbers, but I will address the federal one. I think we're cautiously optimistic about the federal landscape, and let's not lie. None of us know what's going to happen tomorrow. So you can't really make a plan for something that literally changes every day, but we are cautiously optimistic. Right now, we haven't received any notes that, any of our funding has been cut, and we're going to run with that, but we're certainly going to be realistic and recognize that very well could change tomorrow, but certainly could change October 1st when we get into the next fiscal year. We're really relatively safe for now-ish. But I'm going to just read this because I asked our finance people, because they are the experts. And so it's like, we have to look at the overall debt burden. So the home borrowings are planned to coincide with the decrease in the city's overall debt burden. General fund debt service is projected to decline by 180 million in fiscal year 30, which will follow our pension obligation bond balloon payment in FY 29. Because I think that's another question you have as well.
Yes, I did.
And even with the inclusion of the home borrowing, overall debt service is expected to be lower in FY 30 and beyond than it will be in FY 26. And then we've kind of looked at how the new revenue will be generated. So to offset the debt service cost prior to FY 30, we are proposing a small increase to the realty transfer tax, or the RTT, from 3.278 to 3.578%. So this would generate about $173 million in dedicated revenue over FY 26 through 30. And we plan to cover the new debt service associated with the investment through that. And this really ensures that the debt service costs associated with the home borrowing is fiscally supported from the outset. So we are being very thoughtful in that. We recognize that it's a really trying time to be thinking about taking on debt, but we also have to be recognizing the reality is some of our federal funds might go away. So now kind of is the time. We've got nothing but ourselves. And so, that's a perspective we also have to think about and consider as well. So.
Well, yes, you stole my pension fund question. So
I was like, I'm gonna throw them together.
Yeah, we'll just put those all together. So we'll move on to some more sort of thoughtful ideas from other places. So when I was at a APA conference, I sat in on a session that you moderated with some of the top housing providers internationally, the UK, Australia, Canada. It was very interesting, one, just to hear everybody talk about the same problem that they are also facing. But can you talk about some of the solutions that we've seen in other places and how they might be transferred here to Philadelphia?
I think one of the things I found in some of these conversations, even in that session, we are all in the same place. I mean, internationally, we are at a housing crisis. I think it was the UN found that we need to be producing 96,000 affordable housing units per day to meet our affordable housing need globally. And so with that said, a lot of people think about Vienna, and certainly their social housing model is great. I was at the World Urban Forum in Cairo, Egypt in November, and we took a tour of their social housing. I have questionable thoughts on that, in that they're basically in the middle of the desert creating a new Cairo, the new capital, but about 20 minutes, I don't know, some direction from there, they're creating 100,000 affordable housing units. And, we've learned concentrating poverty is not a great idea. But it was a home ownership model. So it was kind of interesting to hear that it was a home ownership, but it was available. They don't do AMI in the way we do, but it was affordable housing for low income. And so despite the concentration aspect of it, and as someone who worked on big towers, because that's what it was, not sure they had the operational budget performers figured out. And I feel like there's going to be a real burden on upkeep on it. But it was interesting to see that they were attempting to create a home ownership model for low income people. And that was kind of a great one to look at. We did a lot of studies with Brazil. So in Australia, so the panel that Leah was talking about was the presidents of the Australian Planning Institute, the Canadian Planning Institute, and the United Kingdom. And all of them kind of have more formal social housing programs that are a national model. And, I think there's pros and cons. I mean, you start talking about state preemption, we get mad. So if you started talking about national preemption, we'd be really mad as well. But when you kind of have some national things that you're following and everybody's following it, kind of gives you some economies of scale. So, it looks interesting to us because we don't have it and they kind of like the format that we have. So, it's always, the grass is always greener.
Yep. I think my family, when we travel, is sick of me going, well, that's public housing and that's public housing. It doesn't matter where you are. You can see it everywhere.
We were doing a tour when I was at Chicago Housing Authority with some folks from HUD, and I never thought about it this way, but she was right. And she was like, okay, we're in our development now. And she wasn't doing it for the real reasons. The blinds were bent. And that was her sign that we were entering into low income housing.
We don't even put blinds anymore. So there's the worst example.
Yeah.
So the state has, and Governor Shapiro signed an executive order, I think here in Philadelphia, implementing a statewide housing plan that is supposed to come out within the year sooner, hopefully. How does the city's home plan sort of tie in with the state housing vision plan to sort of invigorate housing, not just in Philadelphia, but across the state? But how can they sort of play together to be more influential?
Yeah, I think I would say they're complementary. I haven't seen the state plan too much, but we have been working collaboratively with the state. And we will continue to do so. This administration has a great relationship with the governor's office, as you can imagine. Mayor Parker spent a lot of years in Harrisburg herself, so she's got a lot of thoughts about how to work really well with them. And, I think I look at their plan similar to the plan that the Housing Authority here has, as well as a complementary plan that will really support each other. I am a big proponent of looking at housing. We have no problem thinking about transportation on a regional level, but we don't often think about housing on a regional level, but it certainly impacts, because if I can't afford to live here, I'm moving to the next community over and the next community out. And so I like that the state is looking at some comprehensive housing strategies in the same way we are. And let's be clear, I'm going to be asking the state for some housing money. So it's really good timing for me, because I'm like, hey, you guys are talking about it and I'm going to be asking for a big old check. So, I think it's pretty good timing, but it's nice it's the good and bad thing about a housing crisis is everybody is hyper focused on solutions, and the more people working on solutions and supporting that, the better. And it'll help get things up to scale, particularly if we're able to work with a lot of communities that are in the same boat. And, yeah.
Yeah. So the state housing plan and the conversations APA has been having with the state, because we've been very active in the conversations across the Commonwealth. One of the really big things they're looking to do is create housing ready communities. And they need to define that a little bit more, because it's a little bit vague right now. And I think that's going to come out in the plan. But what that means is your community, are your ordinances, are your systems set up to be housing ready? So as we work together as a Commonwealth and a city, how do we create that sort of bridge to togetherness to be housing ready? And those housing ready communities are going to have better access to funding. So we don't know yet what housing ready means. I just learned that term in our meeting last week with the team that's doing the housing plan. But I really think that the city is going to have to be an active participant in that conversation, because I live in central Pennsylvania and the housing conversations and issues are very different, but the dollars are still required to get it done. They might not be as long numbers, but they're definitely still there. So we're excited about the Commonwealth plan, and we're very excited that the city's plan is underway, so we can have that sort of mutual work together to get it done.
Yeah, one of the things that I've noticed from my home state of Washington, which has done something pretty similar, is I got to work on this a little bit. They have model ordinances, because one of the things all things aren't equal when it comes to city budgets for planning staff. And so Housing Ready often has some code revisions and building code revisions that are required. And a lot of communities don't have access to the capital needed to provide that, nor planning staff. And, in another life, I should have gone to law school and been a land use attorney, because I don't know if you've ever seen what people are charging to consult with cities to do that. But listen, I would not be here in the rain. I would be somewhere on an island chilling if I was doing that remotely. So, we've got to definitely think about how do we support. And it's great when states are providing some examples like, this is what Housing Ready means. And these are examples of how you can get there. And we can easily implement it with sample codes and things of that nature.
I agree. And I'm looking forward to seeing what that means for communities, more rural communities who are really, really struggling now. You mentioned the PHA has come in and the Public Housing Agency has come in. There was just an article in the Inquirer about sort of their big plan to do preservation, development in communities. Can you talk about a little bit about how the city and the PHA's relationship can sort of influence that 30,000 number we're gaming for?
This is always like the most popular common question that we get. And, I actually just met with PHA on Friday. As a housing authority alum, I was like, how come I haven't met with you guys and come to your swanky new headquarters? So I spent some time with them, and we are counting our 30,000 units based on what we think our plan will specifically and explicitly do. But we recognize that outside of our 30,000 units, other units will come online, particularly when we start removing regulatory barriers and systemic barriers to create housing. And so, though we are not exactly counting their units in that, we are counting those units in general. And so you'll see the mayor, in her attempt to be very transparent, has what we call Philly Stat 360. So on there, you'll see a housing dashboard that will show all of the housing units that are coming online, and we will absolutely be counting them. And I do think it's a complementary plan. I think a lot of the work that we do, the mayor appoints their boards. They are a quasi-city agency. So it's, but I think a lot of the work that we're going to be doing with both our land disposition and some of the funding will explicitly support the plan that they're doing. And, God willing, and the creek doesn't rise, the federal landscape won't change terribly and create bigger hindrances on them. But certainly I would imagine they're going to probably be hyper-focused on that a little bit more. Well, you work for Housing Authority, so.
Yes, as the director of a housing authority, I have those same feelings every day. No, it's always great when the city and the housing authority can work together, because I think, and essentially the goals are the same, is to get housing on the market, but how we do it can be a little bit different depending on the programmatic changes.
Absolutely.
And the flexibilities that one department has over the other.
And I think one of the things, particularly since our home plan is looking at expanding some of our housing programs to a wider income breadth, one of the biggest questions about the home plan, it's one of the biggest ones, is kind of, why are we not really focused on the deeply affordable housing units? And, the answer really is, it requires a level of supportive services that the housing authority, with their resident services and their funding, are better suited to do. And, I think as someone who just spent the last 5 years of my life working in permanent supportive housing and coming from a housing authority, I recognize that there's some unique infrastructure set up in the way that housing and the services provided around supporting that are better suited than some of the other kind of things that we're working on. And I think, people don't like to say that, but that in fact is true.
No, I agree. So let's talk a little bit about innovation. There's so much happening around technology, AI. How can we use those tools to help us improve our processes, to create housing faster, to reduce barriers, and to help not just the city of Philadelphia, but other cities that may not have staff and may not have those tools? How can we sort of ingrain that without having it take over?
I went to a session. It was actually, I didn't even get CM credit or certificate maintenance credits for my AICP. But I went to a class at a land use law firm before I left Chicago, and they were talking about the ethics around using AI to write code. And, I think it's innovative, because man, writing zoning code is boring as all get out. Like, I wouldn't do it. But, I think when you think about, particularly in the housing space, thinking about how we can incorporate technology, I got to go to a 3D printing factory that was doing a house, which it was helpful to me because I was not a believer And then 60 Minutes did a great special. If any of you haven't seen it, it's really great to see that. But looking at how you can use technology to bring housing to scale online faster, we have to be willing to do it. You know, I think my grandmother used to say, if you want to get something different, you have to do something different. And innovation and technology is a way to do that. And, you know, we can think about, you know, on the flip side, we're in a union town, and I left a union town. You know, when you start talking about a lot of these new building technologies, that is a valid concern that we have to think about how we address. And I don't want to make light of that. And I always do that disclaimer, but I figure we can find a way to work all of that in together. From, you know, we were starting to see in Chicago prefab homes for multifamily housing. We were starting to implement that. Then the pandemic hit and that person went under. But, you know, we've got to start thinking about how we make that happen, and then how we change kind of the norms on what that looks like for us as well. I'm going to say I'm the first one included in that, you know, because I think I went to APA Florida's conference, and they had a mobile, or what's the word, manufactured house on site to tour. And, you know, it's not your grandma's trailer. I was like, I would live in this, you know, I would. Except for I don't like siding, but nevertheless, you know, and so we've got to start thinking about that type of technology and innovation. And, you know, I think the next generation of professionals in the built environment are all about that. So ready or not, here it comes. And we're going to have to start thinking about how we implement that and make room within our building codes, even more so than our zoning codes, that allow room for that. And we're behind the ball on that.
Yeah, I think it's a really great opportunity, and we're seeing these conversations happening all over in every industry. And I think we need to embrace the conversation so that we're not behind the 8 ball when it comes time to really implement. So as the president of APA Pennsylvania, we do a ton of work across the state, but we've generally not been as active here in the city of Philadelphia for any number of reasons. Things are improving over time. Things are definitely better. What can we do to help the city? How can we sort of re-engage this conversation to make sure we're working together and making sure voices are getting heard from the city into the state conversation as well? Because we do a lot of work. I'm in Harrisburg. I am at the Capitol more times than I'd like to be. But how can we make sure that that's working together?
You know, we have an amazing planning department. I don't know how many people are in there, but quite a few of them are APA members. And, you know, I think it's just a matter of time, but I think just reaching out, use me as a resource to incorporate that in. But I think a lot of it is the timing is now. I think everybody is looking at the built environment. You know, I think it's top of my mind because the anniversary just happened, but I think after the murder of George Floyd, a lot of people started thinking about cities and the tale of two cities in a way that you and I probably have always known, because it's what we do for a living. And it made a wider group of people that are engaged in making sure that we don't have two cities and thinking about disparity and equity. And so I think it's into tapping into that. And that's certainly top of the mind of a lot of Philadelphians. And I think a way to get people here in Philadelphia engaged and APA members or planners involved is coming up with that type of programming that's happening in other places and implementing it here. I think displacement is going to be a huge kind of concern and question as we start thinking about the home plan and creating more housing. And, you know, I think non-city people engaging people in those conversations is often really great, the charrettes and all of those things, because no matter how great my heart is on community, people are not going to assume that I don't have an angle of the mayor or somebody because I work for the city, but somebody who happens to have the same level of educational background and me doing it on their own just hits different. And I think that's a really good way to engage.
That's awesome. So I'm going to do one more. It's more of a fun question, and then we will get into Q&A. And since we met on the dance floor and and you love to dance, if housing policy or development, however we want to take it, were a playlist, what songs would you put on it?
Okay, I have 4, and I should preface, I'm a rap fan, so some of you might not have any reference, but my first one is, and it's Home from The Wiz, Diana Ross.
Yep.
And like one of my speeches is entitled No Place Like Home, because The Wiz and The Wizard of Oz, like I love the whole series. I'm a huge fan. I've seen Wicked like 30 times. This one's funnier, and don't judge me. Pusha T featuring Lauryn Hill, Coming Home. little, you have to be a certain age to know these. And I shouldn't admit that I know them, but whatever. Don't get in my car. Little Dirk has a song called Public Housing.
Yep.
And Beyonce has My House, because, I didn't get to go to Cowboy Carter, so I had to throw it out.
Fair enough. Well, I will give you mine, and mine are probably a different theme, and I blame my parents for this.
Who are here, by the way.
Who are here, so there you go. So I was just listening to the top 100 Beatles, and Fool on the Hill came on, and that's a little bit how I felt in that moment. A little Marvin Gaye, What's Going On? And a little Bob Dylan, Times They Are A-Changin'. So I think
Marvin Gaye might be how I got here on this planet.
Yeah, exactly. So there you go. They're different, but both topical. So we are going to open it up to some Q&A. Eli has a microphone. So
Let's first just give him a round of applause.
Oh.
Thank you both.
Thank you.
We have been tremendously fortunate at DAG to have folks like Angela and Jesse Lawrence come out and visit us and tell us what they're up to. We're going to get Octavia Howell. She's drinking from a fire hose at the moment, but we're going to get her out later this year. So I'm going to get to everybody. Just make eye contact, raise your hand, and I'll get to as many folks as I can. All right, you want to start us off here?
Oh, Eleanor is here.
Can you speak to the relationship between housing policy and public safety, quality of life? I think a lot of people are familiar with what's happening in Kensington, where you have a legacy community, but it's frankly a challenge for people to live and thrive there. There are certainly, I'm sure, other places within the city that don't get the attention. But can you talk about, in terms of the city's approach to dealing with issues like that?
Absolutely. And that situation, in situations in other cities, are very sensitive to me. I don't know if any of you have been to Seattle in the last 5 years, but it looks like the zombie apocalypse in all of downtown. And so, I think the mayor's two priority areas really are crime and safety and housing, but how she's addressing issues like Kensington specifically is creating this wellness ecosystem. And the thing I like most about it is it does tie housing in it. I don't know how many of you have been, I don't know the neighborhood, but Riverview, they were able to flip that abandoned vacant building into a recovery center and transitional housing for up to a year in 3 months. And I think that is a good example of innovation and desire to really come up with action-based solutions to a real issue, which are both getting people the help they need to get on a road of recovery, but also providing them the housing support. Because it's not helpful if you take me in, send me to treatment, and put me back in the same streets I left. And so the mayor is committed to looking at how do we expand that model, and we've proven it works, but also how do we look at our partners out there and supporting that work. But it is certainly a huge issue that we're seeing across the country people are having to deal with, but also tying in healthcare supports around that and really creating a whole cycle of both housing and healthcare continuum. And the thing that's great about Riverview is there are medical doctors there, there's treatment there, there's nurses there, and even people who aren't living there can go in and utilize those services, and making those available on a larger scale and duplicating that is a huge priority. And it's certainly, thank you for raising that, because I think it's probably one of the biggest issues every city is facing as we start really dealing with kind of the opioid kind of situation.
Hello, thank you so much for being here. Wanted to ask you a question about the 30,000 homes that will be either built and or renovated. If you could just dig a little bit deeper into the percentage, like what houses will be renovated versus what houses will be built, what your vision is for that. Are you excited about it? Like, where would they be? Like, just a few more details on that part.
Preservation is of 30,000, 16,500 is preservation, and whatever I'm not a math person, the other is as the produced. And, we don't have it defined like by zip code or anything like that. We have it in buckets of programs and how we'll divvy up the 800 million that we're borrowing. So it would depend, but a lot of it we will be using, particularly the producing housing, will be on city-owned land. So we do have a pretty thorough map of where that vacant land is and where that exists. So our biggest partner will be the land bank. One of the things that Leah didn't ask me about, thank you, was around kind of how we will help that process of making land available a little bit quicker. And so we're going to be working on that, but that's going to be the strategy, some of the strategy on that, but then hoping that some of our development partners, I'm looking at some, how we support the work they're doing with some of the systemic improvements to how we are regulating and how we are supporting the permitting process is part of that as well.
And just a quick follow-up, sorry for everyone. The mayor mentioned a $2 billion total investment, $1 billion from the city via bonds, but also $1 billion valuation. Can you just talk about the additional $1 billion of valuation, where that's coming from? Is it from the renovations? Is it from the new building? Like, just flesh that out a little bit more.
So that number is really looking at the value of the city land that we're going to make available. The city has probably around, it's not quite 6,000 lots, but we've got a lot of vacant land. And so that's what the valuation is. And then we're going to be looking for partnerships in funding from both philanthropy, and we're going to be looking at the building trades and their investment in this, because they're going to benefit from a lot of the production side. And so we're going to be asking for their investment in this plan as well. So that's kind of how we get to that number. But a lot of that number really is the value of the city land.
One of the questions I'd have would be mostly around how we're going to work around how we work with zoning, particularly, for example, we do want zoning reform, but do we really want to have, let's say, for example, you have a neighborhood that's all 2-story houses, but then it's rezoned for 3- and 5-story houses, but we're talking about preservation. Could that potentially put the 2-story houses that are already there under threat? But also we would have, like, I always give the example of there's 370 apartments on top of the Target at Broad in Washington, but there are no apartments on top of the Target at Front and Mifflin, where it would make more sense. And so when we're talking about zoning, where are we going to, where exactly would that fit in? And also another question would be around dealing with properties that are known to be historic. Work. As you know, I give Black History tours in just a few.
I was going to shout you out for that.
Thank you. And you've been just like a few blocks from a few weeks ago, we were taking a tour. I was doing a tour down Delhi Street, and I saw 3 houses that were demolished. And I just had to think about the house that we stopped at was a house owned by William Still, the founder of the Underground Railroad. And if that house hadn't been rediscovered maybe 10 years ago, what might have happened to that house? So how do we incorporate actual historical knowledge of an area and research before we actually wind up redeveloping there? Because really we're talking more about redevelopment in the city than development.
Oh man, first of all, if you guys ever want to do a great walking tour, that's a great tour guide. That's how I actually met him. I brought my family, so just shout out to that. But I think, I'll start with the historic preservation one, because I went to school in New Orleans and I have a huge interest in historic preservation. And part of the problem with some of that is a lot of land isn't, well, this is an old city, so it's a little different than in Seattle where nothing's designated. But, I think part of it is if things are officially designated, but I will say there is a huge interest on both the mayor and city council right now on historic properties and those that are designated. And so I think there's actually some bills and legislation that Councilmember Gautier, I think, I'm looking at Eleanor, but I think somebody's working on that, but you should ask Eleanor Sharp about that one. I'm throwing her under the bus. But historic preservation is a huge interest to everybody. I don't have a great answer for that yet, but it's definitely on one of the things that's on the table. And to your other question in terms of zoning, that's where working with the neighborhood organizations like the RCOs is going to be really, really important. But, I think one of the things we have to think about when we start thinking about how do you add more housing diversity to neighborhoods, because I don't like using the word density because that automatically gets people hunched up. So adding more housing diversity is thinking about scale and location. Like obviously a corner would be better to go up higher than the middle of a block. And so kind of thinking about what that is and kind of coming up with design standards that make sense. Working with communities is really, really important. I don't want to minimize that, but we also have to recognize a lot of people in communities don't want those people moving into their communities. So we have to figure out what is the happy nexus between the two of those, because those people could be me as a Black person, but I might be okay because my income's higher. So those people could be somebody. So we've got to think about like the natural nexus of why somebody's opposing housing. And that's a political thing. And, you know, it gets legislated by folks who have a different thing to lose than I do. And so there's no easy answer for that. But I do think that any built environment professional, from an architect to a planner to even an interior designer or historic planner, can really think about scale and where things fit that could be more accommodating. And I think looking at more confusing zoning overlays and things, those are the ways some of those could be done, although I don't know that that's necessarily how people have come up with those to date that could address some of that.
Hi, is there a shining example of a city in America that is where housing is fair and equitable, in your opinion?
I guess, yeah, Minneapolis is the one everybody's saying they're the crown jewel at the moment. And I think their comprehensive plan is kind of like the example planners nerd out about. I don't know that it's been implemented long enough to know if it is working, but you know, they are certainly, and I guess it depends on your opinion if you think eliminating single family is a great thing in a model. But their goal of doing that was really to allow for increasing housing options in communities. I think they do up to a triplex by right in a single, what used to be a single family zone.
It's a triplex, and they have early data that have shown that their zoning reform has produced like exponentially more housing units in the city limits than they produced in the last, I think it's like decade or something.
And
like
it's reduced homelessness by 15%.
Correct. It's done, there's been a lot of effects throughout the city. So Minneapolis is a good one.
And I think I'd also use, this is always an odd one, the state of Montana, like the
Yes.
entire state.
Montana state plan is awesome.
Their state plan pretty much allows up to a fourplex by right in any zone. And it's a good example of economic development because their driver isn't housing the reason I would. Their driver is that show Yellowstone got all y'all moving to Montana and the cost of housing went up like 50%. I was there for their state conference and we were in Lewistown, Montana, and the population's maybe 30,000-ish, but they had a new plant coming and they didn't have any housing. And so it was an economic driver. And it's just a reminder that housing is economic development, but they literally just statewide in any zone, you can do up to a fourplex by right.
I have one question and a comment, one additional question. Is rent control, do you believe, going to be a issue in Philadelphia? And my comment is you should always include in low-income home ownership the possibility of multifamily. In other words, the low-income person would own a multifamily versus just owning a home that they live in.
I mean, I don't disagree with you on that one. I can't say that rent control has been anything we've explicitly talked about. I certainly know there are people in this community that are hyper-focused on that in co-op type models. It hasn't been something we've started talking about. And I'll just add the word yet, because I feel like everything's on the table right now.
A question about design and the role of architects.
Of course, I get that.
Architects get a bad name sometimes when cost is the major issue. And the PHA does not win a lot of architects over to its method, which puts them somewhere as a menial consultant to the construction manager when they build on their own account. So can you comment on your view of the role of design, but also your view of how you're going to implement the new construction projects? Are you going to procure them through developers? Are you going to create your own entities to manage this? Or is that all up for planning right now?
A lot of that I don't have an answer for. I will start with, I think design is important. Any of you have heard the mayor talk, she talks about affordable luxury, and she is committed to ensuring particularly affordable and lower income has the same design things that you and I would want. And so that's a huge priority for Mayor Parker, for sure. I think as a recovering developer, cost per unit is really, really high. And so from the development perspective, figuring out what that marriage is. And I think that's why one of the things that's going to be important as we start implementing the production side, and I'll use Turn the Key as an example. For those of you who aren't familiar, Turn the Key is a program where we provide land and developers generally, what is it, about no less than 10 houses, 10 to 20, but sometimes more, develop houses that they make for affordable home ownership. It's a really amazing program. But one of the things the developers told me, it doesn't pencil out if they don't do it. It has to be to scale. So I think 10 or 20 minimal is the only way they can get it at the price points that we make it available. And one of the ways they're able to do that is they kind of use the same kind of model or prototype for a house. But the design requirements, I toured one, are really, really nice. And so what I appreciated was that design, particularly interior upgrades, was really great. And when you drive through a neighborhood, you can't tell the difference. And I think that is really important because, I think all of us remember the stories in New York about the pour door. We don't want to create that. But we also, particularly in home ownership, want to make sure people are able to get the equity and the value in their home, and design has a big part of that. So I don't think we figured it out how we're going to implement that, but I can tell you we're not starting a city entity to do it. I can promise you that part.
I'll also just add a comment about tax credit development and the design guidelines associated with that. This is my pitch to please talk to PHFA about them. They have created, tax credits outside of the city has created almost all of affordable housing. And you can spot them from a mile away because of the design guidelines, and they can get pretty quirky. My last one, I have 2 units just because they're at the end. The bathrooms are bigger than the bedrooms because of the design guideline requirements. And our architects, while they worked really hard to get around that, couldn't. So I think there are some design guidelines that exist now that could really use some architects' participation and not planners. And I say that lovingly as a planner.
Sounds like a pro bono project, maybe.
It does.
Hi, sorry. I got 2 questions.
He was taking notes. I'm kind of worried.
Yeah, I am a reporter with Biz Now. Please check us out if you're into real estate. So my first question, are you still planning to pass the home initiative with the budget next month? Is that all on track?
It is.
Do you think the home initiative has it evolved at all? And are you planning to change the policies at all based on feedback from lawmakers and community members?
So anybody who knows how the city council process works knows there is going to be a series of negotiations. That has not started yet. I imagine that there will be city council members that are excited about the plan, but might have some different dispersion requirements and requests. So there will be some level of negotiations for sure. I think one of the things that I tell people about the home plan is it's a living, breathing document. So we anticipate that over time, it will ebb and flow. Certainly the money's different, but what's working and what's not working, we want to make sure we are supporting what is working. And so we've got, what's going back to the stakeholder engagement, we've got a home advisory board. And the thing I love and hate about that room is we have people who are not usually at the same side of the table in the room. So we can have some really interesting conversations that really make it a very great process, because we have people who are often opposing each other in thought, and they're a part of the plan. And so as we're implementing the plan, we are going to be open to what that might look like.
What's the timeline for this negotiation council? It's only another month, right?
It's ongoing now.
Okay.
Yeah, council breaks coming up soon.
Hi, Angela. Right here. I'm Taib Smith. I'm on your advisory board, so you asked me not to ask you any questions about the home
I
program.
didn't see you. I was looking over there, but that works for you too.
Yeah. And you mentioned the land bank as being how the 30,000 units were going to be reached.
Some of.
Okay. So I have projects in West Philadelphia, Center City, and Kensington. I'm also on the board of the Kensington Quarter Trust. And I can tell you that I've worked across sector, and the land bank is the most inept institution I've ever had the misfortune of working with. And I struggle when I hear that, because I don't know of any wins from the land bank since its inception in 2013. And in addition, it's had the same leadership. So I beg of you to think like do a deeper dive into the land bank. And then also, I just have to say, like with empathy, you being new to Philadelphia and representing the best interests of the Parker administration, it like my blood pressure went up when you mentioned the land bank as the solution, because I have suffered through dealing with the land bank. And I'm sure that you can ask Angel or Jesse or Mayor Parker about my advocacy and my begging for some type of sunlight to this inept institution. So can you tell me if the land bank is the center of how we're going to get at least a portion of that, maybe a third, with its current makeup, how can that be a possibility?
So part of the home plan, not just, there's a lot of changes going outside of the home plan. And so one of the things I can say is we are looking at staffing of all city and quasi-city agencies that will help implement the home plan. And so when I talk about the land bank, I wouldn't say it's center. I don't think any one thing or one entity is going to be center of achieving our goals around the home plan. You know, I think the land bank gets a lot of negative comments, but they also get a lot of positive comments. And I think Angel and I think Jesse and I think the whole team is committed to making sure that we are providing that level of customer service moving forward. So one of the things you will see as a part of the overall city budget is new positions coming into the planning department to help really implement some of those policies. But I do want to just, you know, note that I hear you. We're going to continue to work to make things throughout the city work better.
Can you tell
and
me
more
one
efficiently.
positive thing about the land bank?
Turn the key.
Hi, everyone.
Oh yeah, another one. It has a lot of land.
Hi, Rebecca Johnson. I'm Executive Director of AIA Philadelphia. And on behalf of the 1,800 architects here in Philadelphia, we're really happy for you to be here. And we also, we wrote an article in this magazine that we published, Advice to the New Mayor. And the one stake in the ground that AIA made was that we love the work of the planning department. We look at other planning departments across the country, and we do not think we have enough people working in the planning department in Philadelphia. And so how does all of this happen? You know, it's at the nexus of communities having a voice, right? It's at the nexus of design and it's a nexus of development. And I ran a community development nonprofit before. And so I know firsthand the impact that the relationships of the planners in the planning department had on facilitating those conversations. So what is your dream for Philadelphia to accomplish all of these amazing things and having a planning department at scale to the size of the problems we're facing?
Well, I suggest all of you send a letter to your council members and tell them to support the budget, which has 32 new positions coming to the planning department. But no, seriously, I do think, you know, one of the things I will note is the planning department is amazing. We have really great staff and we have a great partnership with PHDC, and the two working together has the power to do some really great things. And we are working to get the staffing that is needed to do that. You know, we've got definitely some of the hardest working planners in this country, and they are doing really great work. And, you know, it's been a transition team. We've got a new planning director. We have a new executive director of the Planning Commission. But, you know, you have a city that's committed to customer service, and we recognize that staffing issues are part of that. And, you know, 30,000 units is a lot, and it's a heavy, ambitious goal, but there are other goals within the planning department as well. You've got the redevelopment of Market East. You've got all of these things that are on the horizon. And we recognize the mayor's big thing is economic mobility. And a lot of that starts with planning, design, and built environment, and working to improve that is a huge priority for sure. But definitely 32 new positions are in the budget to go to the planning department, and that's hot now.
So Philly has a lot of narrow lots and lots that are
You're
very
telling me.
hard to assemble, right? And a lot of times when we see a lot of these multiplexes, especially, right, the staircases and a lot of the corridors take up a large portion of the floor plan every time, you know, you have these floor plan built out, maybe 25 to 30%. And there's been a reform now in the single stair reform, I don't know if you know, where, you know, a lot of cities are trying to reform the old fire requirements for at least two stairs beyond 3-4 stories, right? And I think this would really solve a lot of things in Philly where, you know, we have substandard units, we have a lot of sort of unbuilt sort of like capacity available, but we also have a lot of inflated construction costs because of that. I'm wondering, are you willing, I guess it's planning willing to advance any sort of single story reform bill that could really help increase the limit so that we can, get more efficiency out of these?
I'm still adjusting to these narrow lots because it really impacted my closet space. I'll just start with that. But, I think everything is on the table. Nothing is off the table at this time. So now is really the time to be communicating with the planning department about things you think are working and not working. We are looking at how do we speed up development and how do we reduce costs, because we've got per unit costs coming in really, really high, which will be a huge impediment to the plan. So I can't say I've explicitly been in conversations around that, but I'm very aware of kind of the reform going on nationwide around that. And I think everything's on the table right now.
I can stay also at a state level. The state legislature is looking at the single stair to put in the state building codes.
That'll be a great start.
So that could be a successful trickle down that could affect that. And there's a number of other building code changes that are happening at the state level through the Housing Alliance and other agencies that are really working with state legislators, not just because it's impacting rural communities exponentially higher issues, even though land is not as narrow, but that per unit cost could be greatly reduced with some of those building code reductions. So agreed.
And I know the city of Memphis has done a really great job of building code reform. And so that's kind of been a motto that a lot of cities are using.
So right here to your right, Angela. So there are 3 areas of interest that I'd like to ask you about where they fit into the plan. They're related, so I don't think you'll need 3 separate answers. The 3 things are energy efficiency, weatherization, and electrification. And just real quick before you answer, I want to give you a recommendation for your hip hop housing playlist. Okay. Flo Rida, Welcome to My House.
Yes. That is definitely, and I'm looking, so just because I keep looking over here, this is Jamila. She's part of the planning department, but she also works a lot with PHDC. So she knows a lot of the programs a lot better than I do. But one of the things I would say is, part of the plan is to make our housing stock more resilient. And how that's going to pan out is, I can't really say specifically because I don't know that we figured that out, but that is a huge part of the plan. Weatherization is an existing program that we've already been doing a lot of, but I certainly know that we've got to think about, particularly when we're thinking about affordable housing, how do we make the housing stock more resilient? Because the people who can least afford to handle, do we use climate change still? Like the reality of where we are. Yeah. Yes, whether or not we say it or not, I think we have to think about that as a huge impediment to being able to stay in your house. And so, energy burn, I think having been a developer for a housing authority, we finally got to a point as a housing authority that we started thinking about energy efficiency, not because it really wasn't because of the environment, the great environmental, was because the operational cost long-term was better and our performance did better. And so I think you're starting to see a lot more, even nonprofit affordable developers start doing that and implementing that into their plans. And I think that will be a natural progression of where we go here.
I think it's a great connection too with our energy providers. There's so many that, PECO here in Philadelphia, but out in central PA, actually the Housing Authority has partnered with UGI, which is our gas provider, as well as a couple of our energy providers to do weatherization at cost for the Housing Authority for those specific reasons, because operationally it's a lot less expensive. And we've used them as a financial partner so that we're able to do these weatherizations at cost to save our budget. So I think there's definitely going to be a connection there that's going to naturally happen. And I think it's a great opportunity for those energy providers to come into this conversation and, sort of put their money where their mouth is, because they need help with the drain. I mean, with the amount of energy we're using right now with any number of different industries, AI only being one of them, that's going to be an opportunity for them to get involved in community as well.
Hi, Ms. Brooks. Thank you so much for this opportunity. I wanted to ask a little bit about disparity and communities or neighborhoods that's going to be left behind. And the reason I asked that is because right now my community of Strawberry Mansion is under what I consider an assault of 57 rental-only units in a square radius. And it does not provide, it may even be a violation actually of Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, the Fair Housing Act, HUD and AFFH rule, and Philadelphia's Lower North Plan, because we're not the same social economic conditions. There's no opportunity for home ownership. So like other neighborhoods, when you ride around, like they're really advancing. So as we look at this home program, or in our case, a housing project that's moving forward, because the zoning board is determined they're just gonna push it through, is this collusion of people. The tax credits create problems because it's all about, you know, we gotta qualify for these tax credits, and no matter what the community is saying, the tax credits deadline date, so they're gonna go back or we're gonna lose. But that puts a community like mine at risk and at harm. And right now, that's where we are, and there's nobody to say stop. So I just wanted to ask you in your role to don't leave us behind, to not continue this kind of like experiment, because it's a second time around public housing concept where you're still stacking people on top of each other, not enough you know, housing space. And then our children are defective because they can't get the proper social you know, outcome. That, you know, there's no success for them in education, no jobs. It's just a major injustice. So as you all plan to not plan and leave Strawberry Mansion in a ghetto state, creating more ghetto type conditions, as they say, that's just a term because it is created. So I just wanna, we did write to you today. We saw you were coming.
I was about to say, I think I got an email from you today.
Right, so if you could look at that and maybe reach out to us and even talk about which neighborhoods in Philadelphia or which council districts are going to be forced to deal with this same type of pressure. So thank you for your time.
No, thank you for that. And I don't have an answer for you. I did see your email before I came today, and I just haven't had time to look at that. But what I will just say in general, the home plan is a citywide plan, so it's not neighborhood specific. So there's not going to be any neighborhood that isn't impacted by the home plan. And when I say impacted, I mean, we're going to be implementing programs in all neighborhoods. And I think the important thing to note is that the programs in the home plan aren't just necessarily low income or affordable. It is the full housing continuum. Some of the programs go up to 100% AMI. So I think it's worth noting that it's not a concentration one way or the other. As we look at housing, we are looking at it citywide. So there's not anything that's very specific. Now, what is very specific is where city owns land. So we do have the council districts that the land is available that will be up, and it's mapped actually on the land bank site now, and they do have a new website. So that is pretty up to date and accurate. And so that's kind of how we're looking at that. But the goal is to create housing opportunities throughout the whole city.
Hello, I'm Dave Traub. I'm co-founder of Save Our Sites. We advocate for the preservation of the everyday fabric of the city, the whole city. Following up with just what you said about your proposal encompasses the whole city, every neighborhood. But my question is, in doing that, will you concentrate development, redevelopment of existing and new construction in, let's say, little villages, so that at the end of this process, when it's finished, will there be visibility? Now, maybe that's not a good idea, I don't know, but I'm trying to stimulate thought, so that will there be visibility? Will you see what has been done when in a few years this project has been completed?
That would be awesome. You know, I don't think that we've put that specific level of thought into it. A lot of it's going to have to do more with the people sitting next to you who are developers and where they decide to do that work. Sorry to throw you guys out. It's what happens when I know who you are in the room. But, you know, I think one of the things that we are hoping is that this is a transformative program, particularly for neighborhoods that are experiencing a lot of blight, particularly when we start thinking about restoration and preserving. And so there's certainly the intent that reducing blight is part of the program. So that would be one of the goals for sure.
Hi, Angela.
Hi, Kayla.
I have two questions. So in regards to your housing plan, is generational wealth being considered as well? Like not only like having the person like get the house, but also just like helping them beyond that?
Absolutely. You know, I think one of the things that we learned in the mid 2000s or the early 2000s when we had the housing crisis in the boom is that we did a lot to get people in houses, but we didn't think about what it takes to keep them in houses. And so we are making sure that a lot of our program extensions, and part of the reason we're changing some of our AMI requirements in the program is to allow economic mobility. So people are able to get in a house. And if you're doing like the CME or you decide to go to school or whatever, and your income changes and you don't, we want you to still be able to qualify those programs that'll help you keep and stay in your home. You know, one of the things I've learned that I would say is really great about our partnership with PHDC is they have so many programs to help people stay in their homes, restore their homes, and protect their homes. And that's a huge, and if you ever hear Mayor Parker talk about, that's one of her biggest things is ensuring that there's, in this country, home ownership and land ownership is still how we transfer wealth, particularly in communities of color. And that's probably not going to change because I don't see that many people playing in commodities in the stock market like that. So it is going to be important, and it's going to be a thought process for sure moving forward on ensuring people are able to stay in those homes.
And before I get to my next question, what does AMI stand for?
Sorry, area median income.
Gotcha, thanks. For my second question, I know you mentioned the Turn the Key program. Were you considering like having other like extending it to other neighborhoods? Because I know for some of the neighborhoods, they may not be like as safe of an option for housing.
A lot of Turn the Key is based on where the city owns land. And so that's kind of the basis for that. And the city owns land where the city owns land. You know, I think as we start thinking about spurring development in a wider, and I hate the term opportunity areas, it bugs the crap out of me because, you know, generally areas are opportunity because we didn't invest in other ones. So I have a problem with that. But in a wider number of neighborhoods, it's, you know, thinking about how do we remove those barriers and how do we make that available? So, you know, some of the funding that we make available for other programs to spark development will probably help with that as well.
Hi, Angela. Back here.
Oh, okay.
Brian Smiley with HOK, which means I know Kimberly Dowdell.
You probably saw her yesterday.
I did. I had lunch right after you had breakfast with her,
Yes.
which allowed me to quote one of my favorite movies, Points, if anyone gets it. That was a great breakfast. What should we do next? Lunch. So nobody knows where that's from. In any case, she says hello again.
Yes.
And for those of you that don't know, Kimberly Dowdell is the past president of AIA National. I'm the past president of AIA Philadelphia and also work for HOK. But my question has to do with something that we're more than 35 minutes in. I've been waiting patiently, and nobody has mentioned transit yet. So, and that I'm very glad that there's going to be 32 new planners that I know are going to be thinking about transit. And we've already, so I'm going to pander a little bit here. We've already gotten some applause for supporting SEPTA. But what I mean by transit and transit-oriented development, which can be a bad concept in Philadelphia, I've heard, but the way I'm going to make a statement first, and then I'm going to get to my question. My statement is that you cannot build affordable housing unless it's near robust transit. And so I don't know if folks will applaud for that, like they did for SEPTA.
I think most people should agree with that.
Yes. So, yeah. The question is how, so these 32 planners are just gonna get to it. How dark does it need to get with congestion before we get that message? Because if we build housing anywhere, if we allow that just to happen randomly, it's not gonna happen by transit. We've got to be more thoughtful about it. There are train stations all up and down. SEPTA has a TOD plan. There's so many train station opportunities. So my question is, we've been thinking about this a lot at the AIA. It's a chicken or egg thing, you know, because if we allow congestion to happen, people are going to get angry and they're going to demand better transit. And we know that's challenging to fund that, but how dark does it need to get first before we can see the light?
In my 2 months here, I can say I haven't had those conversations yet, so that's my easy out on that. But what I will say, and you might have some thoughts on this as a Philadelphia native, you know, I think about it a lot. I'm a transit user. I'm a cyclist. I walk to work. You know, I have all of the things. I check the boxes. So I think about it a lot. And I certainly think about when we talk about equity in housing, we also have to think about how people can get to and from work. And if we think about economic mobility, we have to be thinking about the correlation between housing, jobs, and how they get there. So the average person isn't walking to work necessarily, and there may not be jobs where in a lot of housing, particularly affordable housing, don't have people, aren't located near centers either. And so we certainly have to start thinking about, and as the city starts getting into the next comprehensive plan, I'm sure that will be part of that. But, you know, I think I'm sensitive to that, certainly. I was telling somebody the other day, I just rode the train for the first time the other day because I generally walk to work. And, you know, I think one of the things I always say, particularly for transit and cycling advocates, particularly when we're talking about low income, and this is my personal opinion, let me clarify that. One of the things we don't talk about is sometimes why people don't want to use it and the parameters around that. I remember when the pandemic started and I lived on the south side of Chicago, and I did not live in Hyde Park or any of the bougie neighborhoods. I lived in the hood. And people like, just walk around your neighborhood. I was like, you come walk in my neighborhood. I'm not. You know, and so we have to think about not only is it about transit, but all of the public safety and the kind of other things that are around it to make people comfortable, because we have to acknowledge that sometimes some of these things are not safe for people, particularly women. We've got to think about like kind of the gender things that we think of. There are times I take an Uber home instead of walking because I'm a woman walking by myself after dark. So we have to think about some of these other elements. And I think sometimes we get in our ivory towers and don't think about the other things people are considering. So I do think transit's important, but I think when we think about that, we have to think all the other things that come with that to make that a viable option for people. But certainly we need to be concentrating housing around transportation, regardless of income level.
Yeah, I think this is something too the state housing plan is specifically trying to address, because in more rural communities where there is no transit, it's even more of an issue. And I face it. I live right near Hershey, Pennsylvania. There's a huge medical center, and right now Hershey cannot find employees to clean the hospital, which means their ORs are not turning over, which means they're losing hundreds of thousands of dollars by the minute because they're not turning their ORs, because our bus system is it's terrible. I used to ride the bus when I worked in Harrisburg, and people thought I was insane. And I was like, it's a bus. Why wouldn't you ride it? And then I moved to a different town, and I used to ride Amtrak to work because it was faster, because there was I took one stop on Amtrak. It was fantastic. But people thought I was insane. And I said, it was expensive, but it was cheaper than parking in the city. So the balance there for me was there, but you can't convince everybody that that's the right balance. And again, it's the same the concepts that we're facing in other areas. But to answer your question as how bad does it have to get? We haven't hit rock bottom yet. So we'll talk about it in a year and see what happens.
We have a way of ending these things on a slightly low ebb, but we have held you longer than we had intended. So thank you so much, Angela Brooks, for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Philadelphia city government has a wonderful way of providing email addresses. First name, period, last name, at phila.gov. So.
Well, no, let's just add, I'm Angela.D.Brooks@phila.gov. And originally I thought they did that because of the press conference announcing me. I made a quirky little comment because I was like, I know all of y'all are Googling me right now, and you need to put the D to make sure you get the real Angela. And then it was part of my email address, but apparently there has been another Angela Brooks that worked for the city.
Thank you for joining us. We really do appreciate it. Remember to say hi to that person sitting next to you, get their email address, and follow up with them. We'll be back here June 18th to talk about 17 Market West. Thank you all.